Welcome back to Audacious History, where we exhume the dead just to appreciate how much harder they threw down than we ever will. Today we are talking about Washington, D.C., a city built on a literal swamp, populated entirely by metaphorical bloodsuckers, stuffed shirts, and puritanical killjoys who think a scandalous evening involves an extra splash of sherry and a really aggressive debate over tariff laws. And then there was Alice Roosevelt, the eldest daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt. If Washington, D.C. was a pristine, fragile porcelain vase of political etiquette, Alice was a gold-plated sledgehammer wrapped in silk and fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. Long before the internet invented the concept of the clout goblin or the political disruptor, Alice was reigning supreme as the original American wild child. She didn't just break the rules of the Gilded Age. She took those rules, rolled them into a fat cigarette, smoked them on the roof of the White House, and blew the ash directly into the faces of the most powerful men on earth. Her own father, a man who literally hunted cougars with his bare hands, charged up San Juan Hill and survived an actual assassination attempt by just continuing his speech with a bullet lodged in his ribs, confessed that he was completely powerless against her. He famously muttered, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." Spoiler alert, he chose the United States of America because running a global empire was infinitely easier than managing his teenage daughter. For over 8 decades, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was the undisputed venom-spitting queen of Washington society. She was the OG mean girl of American politics, a brilliant, chaotic socialite who weaponized her intellect, her status, and her legendary wit to roast every single president from her father to Richard Nixon. She didn't give a single solitary fuck about decorum, political parties, or your feelings. So pour yourself something stiff, pull up a chair, and let's talk about the magnificent, terrifying, and utterly audacious life of a woman who terrorized the nation's capital just for the goddamn thrill of it. To understand why Alice grew up to be a weaponized force of nature, you have to understand the tragedy that forged her. She was born in 1884 to Teddy Roosevelt and his beautiful first wife, Anne Hathaway Lee. It should have been a fairy tale. Instead, it became a horror movie. Just 2 days after baby Alice was born, her mother died of undiagnosed kidney failure. Compounding the nightmare, Teddy's mother died in the exact same house on the exact same day, just 11 hours earlier. Teddy was so profoundly shattered by this double-fisted strike of grief that he literally could not bear to look at his newborn daughter. He refused to say her mother's name ever again. He packed his bags, left baby Alice with his sister, and fled to the Dakota Territory to live as a heartbroken, cattle-driving cowboy. When Teddy eventually returned, remarried, and reclaimed his daughter, Alice had already developed a fierce, feral independence. She wasn't just a child. She was a survivor of emotional abandonment who realized very early on that if the world wasn't going to cater to her, she'd make the world her bitch. She resented her stepmother, she clashed with her half-siblings, and she utterly refused to be molded into a proper, quiet Victorian lady. While other girls her age were learning how to embroider napkins and practice their posture, Alice was reading her father's entire library, forming scathing political opinions, and learning how to shoot firearms. In 1901, the world changed forever. President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, and suddenly Teddy Roosevelt was thrust into the presidency. Alice was 17 years old when her family packed up and moved into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, imagine being the Secret Service or the White House staff at this moment. You are used to McKinley. a stiff, formal, deeply traditional Victorian administration. And suddenly, the gates burst open and in marches Teddy Roosevelt, a hurricane of a man, followed by a pack of chaotic children, a literal zoo of pets, including bears and guinea pigs, and at the center of it all, Princess Alice. She wasn't just entering the White House, she was invading it. The American public instantly fell in love with her. She was beautiful, stylish, and vibrant. A specific shade of gray-blue became known as Alice Blue, sparking a national fashion craze. Songs were written about her. Women copied her hair. She was the world's very first modern celebrity influencer. But while the public saw a dazzling debutante, the Washington establishment was about to realize they had let a Trojan horse filled with pure anarchy into the executive mansion. Alice quickly realized that being the first daughter came with an immense amount of spotlight, but also a suffocating prison of expectations. Society expected her to sit quietly, look pretty, host tea parties, and wait for a respectable man to marry her. Alice's response to that expectation? Fuck that and fuck you. She began indulging in behaviors that at the time were considered absolute social felonies. First off, she smoked. Now, in 1902, a woman smoking a cigarette in public was practically viewed as an act of domestic terrorism. It was synonymous with loose morals and rebellion. Her father, desperate to maintain a shred of presidential dignity, explicitly banned her from smoking under his roof. Did Alice stop? Abso-fucking-lutely not. She simply climbed out of her bedroom window, scaled the architecture, and sat on the literal roof of the White House, puffing away on unfiltered cigarettes while looking down on the streets of Washington like a gargoyle wrapped in couture. Technically, she wasn't smoking under his roof. She was on it. Logic. But cigarettes were just the gateway drug to her brand of chaos. Alice loved to shock people, especially the self-righteous, pearl-clutching politicians who frequented White House dinners. Her favorite accessory wasn't a diamond necklace or a fancy fan. It was a live, bright green garter snake. She named it Emily Spinach, allegedly because it was as green as spinach and as thin as her Aunt Emily. Alice would tuck Emily Spinach into her silk purse or wrap the reptile casually around her forearm beneath her long evening gloves and head off to a formal gala. In the middle of a conversation with a stuffy diplomat or a conservative senator, she would casually open her purse to retrieve a handkerchief, allowing a live snake to poke its head out and hiss at them. While duchesses shrieked and cabinet members nearly suffered cardiac arrest, Alice would just smile, stroke the snake's head, and continue talking about naval policy. She was also a menace on the streets. She bought a high-powered automobile, drove it at terrifying speeds through the cobblestone streets of D.C. without a chauffeur, another massive taboo, and was frequently pulled over by cops who didn't know whether to arrest her or apologize to her father. She placed massive bets at horse races, stayed out until the break of dawn, and was seen publicly cash betting in bookie parlors. Washington had never seen anything like her. She was a one-woman wrecking crew tearing through Victorian morality. Naturally, this behavior eventually led to an absolute explosion behind closed doors. The tension between Teddy and Alice wasn't just a regular father-daughter dispute. It was a clash of titans. Two identical, hyper-dominant personalities trapped in the same historical moment. One evening, after Alice had made headlines for reportedly hitching a ride with a strange man in a fast car and being seen at a racetrack, Teddy summoned her to the executive office for a formal dressing down. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The air was heavy with the scent of mahogany, ink, and impending doom. Teddy slammed his fist down on the desk, the inkwells rattling. "Alice!" he roared, his voice cracking with that trademark aristocratic anger. "You are bringing disgrace upon this administration. The newspapers are treating you like a circus sideshow, and your behavior is completely unbecoming of a young lady of your standing." Alice didn't even flinch. She slowly leaned against a high-backed leather chair, looked her father dead in the eye, and let out a soft, mocking sigh. "Father, the newspapers are bored because your politicians are boring. I am simply providing the public with the entertainment they deserve." "You are providing them with scandal!" Teddy bellowed, pacing behind his desk, his chest puffed out like a silverback gorilla. "Smoking on the roof? Carrying a reptile into diplomatic dinners? Do you have any conception of the delicate nature of international relations right now? I am trying to mediate a peace treaty between Russia and Japan, and I am being asked by foreign ambassadors why my daughter is driving a motor car like a lunatic through the Capitol." Alice casually reached into her pocket, pulled out a silver cigarette case, and tapped a cigarette against her thumbnail. "Perhaps if your diplomats possessed half the backbone of my motor car, the treaty would already be signed." Teddy gasped, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You will not smoke in this office! You will not smoke in this house!" "I am not smoking, Father," she replied smoothly, holding the unlit cigarette between her lips. "I am merely holding it, much like you hold your temper, uselessly." Teddy stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at her, his teeth gritted, furious but secretly harboring that deep, twisted Roosevelt pride in her absolute lack of fear. He realized in that exact moment that he could command armies. He could bust corporate monopolies. He could rewrite American foreign policy. But he could not, under any circumstances, make Alice Roosevelt behave. He slumped back into his chair, rubbed his temples where a massive headache was brewing, and growled the words that would echo through history. "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." Alice smiled, tucked her unlit cigarette back into its case, and said, "Then I suggest you focus on the country, Father. It seems to need the help." She turned on her heel, her silk skirts rustling like a battle flag, and swept out of the room, leaving the President of the United States utterly defeated in his own office. God, imagine having that much unbothered energy. If you're enjoying this peek into history, do your civic duty, hit that subscribe button, it really helps the channel. Now back to the story. By 1905, Teddy Roosevelt had reached his absolute limit. He needed Alice out of Washington before she accidentally started a civil war or destroyed his re-election prospects. So he did what any desperate parent with the resources of the federal government would do. He sent her away on a massive, months-long diplomatic cruise to Asia. The delegation was led by Secretary of War William Howard Taft, and it was supposed to be a serious, dignified mission to foster relations with Japan, China, and the Philippines. Sending Alice on a diplomatic mission to foster dignity was like throwing a hand grenade into a fireworks factory to stop a fire. The journey across the Pacific was an absolute shit show of epic proportions. Alice spent the cruise flirting with every young officer on board, staying up all night and completely overshadowing Taft, who was supposed to be the actual star of the show. At one point, bored out of her mind during a very stuffy day on deck, Alice decided she needed to cool off. Did she go change into a sensible conservative swimsuit? No. She fully clothed herself in her finest linen dress, shoes and all, walked up to the edge of the ship's swimming pool, and executed a flawless, dramatic leap directly into the water. She then coaxed a congressman who was traveling with them to jump in after her, completely ruining thousands of dollars worth of tailored clothing just because she thought it was funny to see a politician look like a drowned rat. When they arrived in Asia, The foreign monarchs didn't know what to make of her, so they treated her like American royalty. The Emperor of Japan hosted her. The Empress Dowager Cixi of China showered her with gifts, including a magical, valuable collection of black pearls. In the Philippines, the Sultan of Sulu was so absolutely enchanted by her fierce, unyielding attitude that he gifted her a collection of rare, intricately carved stiletto daggers. Alice loved them. She spent the rest of the trip casually playing with the knives during boring diplomatic speeches, reminding everyone present that she was beautiful, rich, and highly dangerous. When she returned to America, her celebrity status was at an all-time high. She was 22, brilliant, and untouchable. But society was screaming at her to settle down. So in 1906, she finally got married. Her chosen groom was Nicholas Longworth, a wealthy congressman from Ohio. The wedding was the social event of the century. It was held in the East Room of the White House, attended by thousands of international dignitaries, royalty, and celebrities. Alice, being Alice, didn't want a traditional, boring wedding ceremony. When it came time to cut the wedding cake, she looked at the silver cake knife, decided it was far too small and pathetic for her liking, turned to a nearby military aide, snatched his ceremonial steel dress sword right out of his scabbard, and hacked the wedding cake to pieces with a broadsword while laughing maniacally. If you think marriage tamed her, you are profoundly mistaken. Nicholas Longworth was a notorious womanizer and a heavy drinker, and Alice quickly realized that he was a bit of a political lightweight compared to her. She didn't care. She didn't marry him for love. She married him for an all-access permanent VIP pass to the halls of Congress. She used his position to establish herself as the premier political hostess in Washington. She openly mocked his political views, refused to campaign for him, and when he later became Speaker of the House, she used her salon to actively manipulate the votes of his colleagues right under his nose. She was no longer just the president's wild daughter. She was evolving into her final form, the shadow dictator of Washington's high society. In 1909, Teddy Roosevelt's presidency came to an end, and his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, moved into the White House. Alice was absolutely furious. She felt that the Tafts were usurpers moving into her house, and she despised Taft's wife, Nellie, with the heat of 1,000 dying suns. Most people, when moving out of a house, leave a nice note or maybe a bottle of wine for the incoming residents. Alice Roosevelt? She chose supernatural warfare. On her final day in the White House, Alice snuck into the pristine, manicured lawns of the South Lawn. She pulled a handmade, detailed voodoo doll of the incoming First Lady, Nellie Taft, out of her bag, dug a hole in the dirt with her bare hands, buried the doll deep in the White House soil, performed a mock ritual curse, and threw the dirt back over it. Whether you believe in voodoo or not, the universe definitely heard her. Within a few months of taking office, Nellie Taft suffered a massive, debilitating stroke that kept her out of the public eye for years, and Taft's presidency became a disorganized, chaotic disaster that fractured the Republican Party. Alice openly bragged about her curse for decades. Do not fuck with Alice Roosevelt. She will literally bury an effigy of you in the lawn and watch your life fall apart over tea. As the decades rolled on, presidents came and went. Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and to Alice, they were all just an endless parade of mediocre men playing dress-up in her father's old house. She moved into a massive mansion on DuPont Circle, which became the epicenter of Washington power. If you wanted to pass a bill, launch a campaign, or survive a political scandal, you had to go to Alice's salon. And entering Alice's salon meant entering a verbal gladiator arena. She became the ultimate Washington mean girl. Her wit was so sharp she could cut glass, and she spared absolutely no one, regardless of party affiliation. In her sitting room, resting proudly on her favorite sofa, was an embroidered pillow. It bore a phrase that perfectly summarized her entire philosophy on life. If you can't say anything good about someone, sit right here by me. Oh, I love that. And oh, did people sit? Everyone from Supreme Court justices to foreign ambassadors crowded around that pillow just to hear Alice absolutely disembowel the egos of the American political elite. Let's take a look at a few highlights from her 80-year burn book. When her distant cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, ran for the presidency, she despised him for riding on her father's coattails. She publicly described FDR as 1/3 slobber and 2/3 mush. When Thomas Dewey, the slick, meticulously groomed Republican nominee, ran for president in 1944, Alice took one look at his perfectly parted hair and his small, neat mustache and completely derailed his campaign's cool image by announcing to the press that he looked exactly like the little man on top of the wedding cake. The insult stuck so hard that the public literally could not look at Dewey again without laughing. She turned her guns on Calvin Coolidge, a man famous for being quiet, stoic, and incredibly dry. Alice's assessment? She told a packed room of reporters that Coolidge always looked like he had been weaned on a pickle. Even when the era of Camelot arrived in the 1960s and John F. Kennedy took over Washington with his youth and glamour, Alice remained unimpressed. She attended White House dinners well into her 80s, wearing her signature dramatic oversized hats and capes, looking like a high-fashion dark wizard. She openly mocked JFK's administration, and when Lyndon B. Johnson later took office and famously showed the press the surgical scar on his stomach after a gallbladder operation, Alice looked at the photo and dryly remarked that it was a shame he hadn't used the opportunity to get a vasectomy instead. She was completely, utterly savage, and the best part? The more she roasted them, the more they loved her. Politicians were so terrified of being on her bad side that they actively courted her favor, begging to be invited to her house just so they could be insulted to their faces by the grande dame of the Capitol. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived to the ripe old age of 96, finally passing away in 1980. She had lived through the Gilded Age, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, Vietnam, and Watergate. She had seen 18 different men sit in the Oval Office, and she had outlived almost all of them. She never held an official political office. She never wrote a piece of legislation. She never marched in a protest. Yet she was one of the most powerful and influential figures in the history of Washington, D.C. She managed to survive and dominate a deeply sexist, patriarchal political system, not by playing by their rules, but by completely rewriting the game. She proved that power didn't just come from an electoral vote or a military title. Sometimes power is just having the sheer, unadulterated audacity to look the most powerful men in the world in the eye, call them idiots, and keep a live snake in your purse just to remind them who the real alpha is. Alice was the original, definitive Washington disruptor. An OG mean girl with a genius intellect who chose chaos every single day of her life. So the next time you feel like you're playing it a little too safe or worrying too much about what people think of you, channel your inner Alice. Climb up onto the roof, light one up, and remember, if you can't say anything good about someone, come sit right next to me. Thanks for watching Audacious History. Leave a comment below with your favorite Alice roast. Hit that like button, and I'll see you in the next one for more historical madness. Stay audacious, friends.